You're with David Kurten and today's News Talk, TNT.
Hello and welcome to the David Kurten Show. I am David Kurten and I am delighted to be joining today's News Talk TNT. There's never been a need for a station like TNT because we are in the midst of government tyranny and overreach like never before. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about myself as this is my first show with TNT. Now, I got into politics actively about 10 years ago. And as I've said many times, I got into that because I was concerned mainly about two things. Firstly, the globalists and what they were doing to take away freedom and national sovereignty for me in the UK, but also around the world. And how it was particularly manifest 10 years ago was with the European Union. And I fought for Brexit back before the referendum in 2016. That seems like a long time ago now. The other thing I was concerned about was what was then known as political correctness. And already 10 years ago, that was curtailing people's free speech in ways that I'd never imagined could possibly happen in the West, because we've always said, and I always heard growing up, we live in a free country. You can say what you like, you can do what you like. But today, no one would say that anymore. We understand that we don't actually live in a free country anymore because our freedoms are being taken away. We still have some freedom and we need to fight for it, but we are in a battle. And if we don't fight, we're going to lose it. So that's why I got actively involved to fight political correctness. But over the 10 years since then, since I started getting involved actively in politics, that has warped even more into what we now understand as wokery. That's a word which is used a lot to describe the attacks on freedom of speech and all the smearing that goes along against people who don't toe the mainstream line and the lines that are coming up against you from the powers that be. But the actual ideology behind that, as I've spent many times and given many talks on, is cultural Marxism. And that is something that creates oppressor-victim narratives when there is no oppression, but the idea is to completely undermine our society, our values, our freedoms, and our democracy. But over the last 4 years, that has accelerated into something that I never even would have imagined 10 years ago, when all of the attacks were becoming apparent on freedom and free speech through cultural Marxism. And we know, and I'm sure you know if you watch this channel, that every year since 2020, there has been a new thing coming at the people, where the government, the mainstream media, the behavioral psychology units, the deep state, whatever you like to call them, and however they are all mixed together, every year they have thrown something at us to advance their agenda. In 2020, you know, it was COVID and lockdowns. And if you didn't go along with it, if you questioned it, you were called a granny killer or a COVIDiot. Then in 2021, there was the injections, the experimental injections, which is the correct name for what the mainstream and the governments call vaccines, which they do to try to give them some kind of credibility that they shouldn't have. And if you didn't go along with that, well, then you were called a super spreader or an anti-vaxxer. Then in 2022, there was the whole war narrative with the Ukraine situation. And I said from the very beginning, like many people here, that this was a war that didn't ever need to happen. But if you went along, if you didn't go along with the narrative, sorry, you were called Putin's puppet or a modern day Chamberlain, or someone who was an appeaser. And people said that to smear you if you didn't go along with that narrative. And then we have in 2023, the whole situation with the Middle East kicking off. And my take immediately was that we are all being corralled into taking a side on this, even when this is nothing to do with most people in the West. All we should be doing is calling for peace and calling for a ceasefire so that people on both sides can save their lives. And so we minimize the death and the killing and the war and destruction that's happening. But then this again has morphed this year into new narratives of war, and war is being talked up, conscription is being talked up, and many other things that advance the globalist agenda, while they continue to push new narratives, new fake viruses, and new methods of control, which are trying to take over. Now, what I see we have to do is we have to act and speak out immediately. We see some jiggery-pokery going on by the people in power. Don't wait. Back in 2020, I was cautious. I waited a little bit. I said what needed to be said, but I held back in actually going guns blazing against the powers that be. What we have to do is speak out immediately, and I'm glad to have this platform where I can do that, and I'm going to be talking to lots of wonderful guests who will do that as well. Thank you for being with me today. This is today's News Talk TNT.